Welcome, everyone, to Bridging De Pere, where the city takes a few moments to have an in-depth conversation about key topics within our community. My name is Marty Kosobucki, happen to be the Park, Recreation, and Forestry Director here. Today, we're going to talk about something that we've had received a number of concerns and calls over the years. That topic is urban deer within the city here. And concerns, such as what has been done, what options are there to do something about urban deer, and what are limitations. So pretty fortunate today to have with me Steve Burns from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're a wildlife biologist with the DNR.
That's correct.
Super. So Steve, before we get into a lot of talk about the deer, why don't you give us some background about, hey, why are you here, and why do you know much about what we're talking about?
Yeah, so I've always loved the outdoors, natural resources. I pursued a bachelor's degree in wildlife ecology and management, and kind of job hopped a little bit around the country. Worked for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department for a while, Iowa DNR for a while, managed the Wildwood Park and Zoo in Marshfield before my dream career here as the wildlife biologist out of the Green Bay office, but covering Brown, Door, and Kewaunee counties. Gives me a lot of opportunity to deal with different wildlife from, Kewaunee County being primarily agricultural to Brown County very urban and Door County just a beast of its own.
So with the topic we're talking today about urban deer, have you worked with a lot of communities with problems, concerns that come up?
I have, actually, yeah. So most of the kind of greater Green Bay area municipalities have contacted me at one point or another in the past few years just to say, hey, we're getting a lot of calls about these urban wildlife nuisance issues. What can we do? What are our options? Do we even have a problem? So I've had a lot of visits to council meetings or just community leaders and kind of explained what the DNR's role is and tried to offer some advice and resources for communities looking to move forward.
So you've been involved with this topic, not only in the sense of like one community, but multiple communities.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of, as you probably know, this particular topic has just a tremendous amount of layers to it. But let's talk about the very first layer of this. Like, what kind of problems can urban deer cause a community?
Yeah, so the biggest issues that we see are concerns with car vehicle collisions, damage to property like ornamental plantings or gardens. And we're seeing an increase in concerns over disease vectors, specifically like Lyme disease. And also just, while extremely rare, we can occasionally have just, a direct deer-human interaction that, has negative connotation.
Yeah. So along that line, I know exactly what you're talking about. We've had here in De Pere 2 instances that I'm aware of. Probably about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a male deer around the St. Norbert area. And for the lack of better explanations, it became domesticated. So during the summer months, I was actually there to watch this. My son was playing baseball in the old baseball field that St. Norbert had. And this little 6-point buck came walking out, went from kid to kid, and it wasn't harming anyone, but it would go from kid to kid. It was basically looking for food. And it would just go there. The kids would touch it. It would go to the next person, and then it figured out it wasn't going to get any food, and then it walked off into the trees. Well, unfortunately, for those of us that understand deer, and some that don't, but come November, that domesticated deer turned into a problem. And can you explain to the community like what kind of goes on? A doe deer is a whole lot different being domesticated than a buck deer.
Sure. So, a doe might be aggressive at actually this time of the year in spring when they might be defending fawns. Fall is breeding season where bucks or male deer can become, aggressive in search of a mating opportunity. So, the situation that you mentioned where you have a buck whitetail with, full grown antlers, coming into close contact with humans that it should fear naturally, right? but because it had become habituated or domesticated and lost that natural fear of humans, that just puts wildlife into, a proximity to humans that we shouldn't be comfortable with. While it is domesticated or habituated, it's still a wild animal and unpredictable in its nature, especially during a breeding season.
Yeah, it's, and I had mentioned I'd come into that twice. So the second time was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and we had a domesticated buck around the West De Pere School District, or West De Pere High School area. And we got a call. There was a call that came in from the community members saying, "Hey, there's a buck that's beating up a mailbox." So our officer went out there, and when the officer went out there, the buck turned aggressive on the police car.
Sure.
Well, that's not good, and so correct me if I'm wrong. It's probably pretty good advice that, yeah, it's pretty cool maybe to go and pet a deer that's trying to, it's probably not a good idea to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to keep wildlife wild. We want to keep their healthy fear of humans so that when we're in proximity to animals, that we both have like expectations about how each other is going to act, right? We expect that if we get close to a wild animal, the wild animal is going to flee. When over time it's learned that we're not a threat, that can cause issues.
Yeah. So, all right. So we talked, there's some problems. When urban deer are here in the city, not just our city, but other communities, right? There's problems. So the deer will come and eat their plants. There's greater probability for car deer crashes. There's the domesticated issue that goes into this. And people in general, where there's a large herd or even a concentrated herd, they're going to beat up someone's lawn. They're going to, when deer eat, what do they got to do afterwards? Well, they have to, deposit a few, things, let's just say, and where, that can pile up in someone's yard and rip people's yards up in their plants. So there's problems, right? So what do we do about it? So if a community, calls are coming in and the community thinks they have a problem, what can they do?
Sure. Well, one thing to recognize is that a deer issue in a community is just as much a social issue as it is a biological issue. We have to recognize that people within a community have a different idea of what a problem is. Some people might enjoy seeing wildlife. It brings them joy to see wildlife, in their backyard or things like that. So we always have to recognize that one person's problem is another person's joy. I think we can all recognize that too many deer or deer that have become habituated pose a bigger issue in a community. And like you mentioned, when we get these unnatural concentrations of deer, that's when we really start to see, the negative issues start stacking up. So one thing people can do right off the bat is let's just not feed wildlife. By and large, the vast majority of times, wildlife do not need our help to survive. They're well adapted to the environment they live in. So while we might like seeing, deer come to the pile of corn we leave in our backyard, that's really not good for the deer. It's not good for the community, and it can put increased pressure on the habitat surrounding this property. So, that's one thing I like to educate people with right off the bat is by feeding, we're attracting an unnatural concentration of animals, and that can lead to spread of disease, like you said, excess of defecation, on people's lawns, pets getting into that. It can change deer's movement throughout a community, so bringing that kind of traffic issue back into the scenario where deer might be crossing a road more often to get to this feed. Yeah. So you just really like to remind people, don't feed wildlife.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to that a little bit. But what I want to go a little bit sideways. So when I asked the question, like, what can communities do? I want to focus on if we think there's a problem, or if we're not sure there's a problem, what can the community do as a whole? So like, what steps should a community go through to determine if there is a problem, or if there is something significant enough that they need to do something about that deer population?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things we want to do is make sure that we're empowering people to share their opinions about the issue, whether it's through public forums or online, and we want to keep that data as we collect it to see over time, are we seeing increased complaints, decreased complaints? What are the nature of the complaints? Are there hot spots throughout the community? So, basically establishing where we're at, and then over time we can decide, is there a different place we want to be? And then we can decide how we get there. Because, there's obviously, even in this conversation already, a bunch of different rabbit holes that we can go deep down and spend a lot of time on.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong. Most of the communities, when they kind of kickstart a process to figure out, right, if there's a problem, you need to have some sort of data that supports that. You can have all of the people, you can have a whole bunch of people saying, you have a problem, you have a problem. But what data is that? There's no data that goes with that. So what are the steps that communities go through to start getting that data?
Sure. So it depends on the community, but the department does have grant funding available to any community with a population density, a human population density above a certain level, where that community can apply for dollars, and they can use those to develop a management plan, to do a survey to start to gauge the number or density of wildlife in the community, to do a public information campaign or create educational materials. So communities should be aware of that grant money, and then just start to decide how that individual or that community wants to approach the issue.
Yeah. So back in 2014, we actually received a grant from you folks. We actually did an aerial survey with our neighbors in Alloway and Ashwaubenon, if I'm not mistaken. I know Alloway for sure. I think Ashwaubenon was part of it. But we did aerial survey at the time. And I thought it was pretty darn cool because at the time they did surveys via helicopter. So I actually got to go up in a helicopter and, we're flying about, like 20 feet off the top of the treetops. And we're going through all these parts of the city counting deer. And that's how we got our data. Now, recently, with technology, that's changed a little bit, right?
Sure.
And it's probably a little more accurate than the whole helicopter method. And what is that method now?
Yeah, so now we're seeing a lot more use of drones with thermal imaging, so they can fly either specific hotspots where we know deer are hanging out or transects over communities. But the thing to remember about getting that data is that that's a minimum deer count. There could always be more deer that were missed in our transects. And also not to dwell too much on those numbers. Let's look at the impact of those numbers. It's good to have that baseline data so that we can compare, okay, if we've got 100 deer, say in this block, and there's no problem, well, then maybe 100 deer is to maintain that is our goal. If we've got 100 deer in this area and we've got a lot of complaints, then we can use that 100 as a metric to move down from.
Yeah. So I mentioned we did a survey. We've done 2 surveys actually here at the city. So back in 2014, we did a survey, again, with the communities that I mentioned. And then in 2024, we did another survey. So about 10 years after, we did another survey, and that was with the USDA thermal imaging drone. And the numbers that we have, so let me just bounce a couple numbers off you. So in one of our sections in 2014, we had 22 deer that were counted. And let me keep this in mind that this isn't a per square mile count. We created sections, and our sections were based on man-made figures, so it's easy to understand. So all the sections aren't the same size. So it's, there might be 30 deer in this section and 5 deer in this section, but the concentrations might be, right? So a couple of our sections, on the west side, we had, in our section 1, we had 22 deer in 2014. In 2024, we analyzed the same section, we had 33 deer. In section 2, we had 29 deer in 2014. In 2024, we had 22 deer. On the east side, a couple of our sections, we had one section where in 2014, we counted 5 deer. In 2024, we counted somewhere between 28 and 36 deer. So that was a pretty big change. I'll come back to that in a second, though. Another one, we had 0 deer, and then we in 2014, and then we found 10 deer in 2024. The east side is unique in that where in 2014 we partnered with Alloway. In 2024, we were by ourselves. So there's some of these high concentrations were next to Alloway. So without knowing how many deer were in Alloway at the time, it's tough to say if that herd, grew that many, because in 2014 we had 22 deer and Alloway might have had 28. Now we might have had 33 in 2024. They might have had 4. So without knowing that, it's hard to say. But nevertheless, we have quite a few deer, here in the city of De Pere. In looking at our numbers and your experience in working with other communities, I'm trying to walk you into here a dead-end question, but do we have a problem here in the city of De Pere?
Sure. So based on data alone, I don't know. Do you have a problem? What are your constituents saying, or what is the community saying? And that's really what we need to drill into. Is there's not a magic number where we can say like, oh, if you've got this many deer per square mile, you've got to do something about it. It's let's take a more holistic view here and say, are car collisions increasing drastically? Or are the number of complaints coming into City Hall about, deer decimating my garden, are those going up? Obviously in situations like this, the squeaky wheel sometimes gets the grease, where people don't call to say, I'm having a great day. No deer got into my garden today. Mm-hmm. I didn't hit a deer on the way to work today. So you're only getting the negative issues. But let's not dwell on the number. Let's dwell on kind of the trends overall.
Yeah. I remember a conversation that you and I had back a long time ago. And I remember when we were first going through the deer issue, we wanted hard answers. Mm-hmm. And the question to you and the DNR was, okay, what's the number of deer in a community where it says you have a problem? And I remember you saying, you're like, DNR can't tell you that. You have to, each community has to figure it out. And I remember I'm like, doggone it. I'm like, I want something that helps me make this decision. But the more I thought about it, and then as time went on and I've talked with more people, I think the DNR is exactly right in taking that position, because every community's tolerance is different. Just because you have one person that complains about a deer doesn't mean the whole community feels that way. Where inevitably you could have 90% of the community saying, hey, I know they eat my plants, but I love watching them, or vice versa. You could have 90% of the community going, there's only 10 deer around here, but that's too many. Mm-hmm. So you're right. The community really has to make that decision. And where I appreciate the DNR and your help, you don't make that decision for the community, but you help them get to that point.
Yeah.
Right.
Something that I've spent a lot of time trying to, I guess, get the message out is we're not going to tell anyone what to do. We can permit certain, management strategies that a municipality might want to, employ. But it's not up to us to decide what your tolerance level for damage is. I want people to keep in mind that we are never going to get to a point where there's zero impact, right? There's always going to be some number of deer in a community.
Yeah, kind of like it's hard to fish out a lake.
Exactly. So we're not going to get this down to there's zero negative impact, but we have to, as a community, decide where the balance is between seeing wildlife, enjoying wildlife in our community, and the negatives that come along with that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to put you on the spot. So you already said that the DNR doesn't tell a community that you have a problem. But do you think, based on the numbers that you're looking at and compared to other communities, do you think we have a problem?
Compared to other communities, no. but I think you all have a little bit of a problem.
Yeah. More ways than one, maybe.
So there are more deer in all the municipalities that I work with than I think is ideal, right? By and large, we get a lot of complaints. We know that there's a pretty high tolerance for wildlife in our communities. So even with that higher tolerance, we're seeing like, okay, people are kind of meeting their threshold here. They're asking for something to be done here. In kind of where I spend a lot of my time estimating wildlife numbers and things like that is outside of the municipalities and across what we'd call the farmland units. So the counties that make up this area of the state, the deer population is well above like a biological carrying capacity or a number of deer on the landscape that aren't negatively impacting the landscape itself. We're seeing forest regeneration be disrupted. We're seeing a lot of crop damage in agriculture. So it's not that municipalities have a unique problem. It's most of this area of the state has deer concentrations higher than we've seen in history.
So, all right. So we've been through a couple layers already. So like, meaning what problem do deer cause? What can communities, like, what do they need to do to figure out if there's a problem? So the next question is, if a community wants to go down the path of herd reduction, what does that entail? What can they do?
Sure.
Because I know this is where, we'll get into it a little bit later, but this can go all different ways.
Sure. And once you decide to take action is, where things can really heat up, right? Because no matter what a community decides on, we've already established that this is a social issue with people on both sides of it. Whatever a community decides on, about half the people are going to be upset with that action.
Right.
So what I typically recommend as a first step is that a community make it easier or empowers individual citizens to take the action that they think is appropriate. So public hunting is a great example. So, take a look at your firearms, ordinances, and obviously we want to maintain public safety. But are there things that we can do to allow someone who owns 6 or 7 acres on the edge of town to hunt that 6 or 7 acres easier,
So I'm going to jump in because you went into the topic where it gets really dicey, right? So I've talked to a number of people that have said, listen, these deer are killing my yard. I want them gone. Okay. How do you want them gone? Well, just trap them and get rid of them. And I'm like, well, that's really, in my experience and understanding, that's not an effective method. The most effective method for herd reduction, if I'm correct, is through either hired sharpshooters or public hunting. So their comment to me back was, well, I don't want them to die. Well, I'm like, well, you don't want the deer, but you don't want to utilize the most effective method to reduce the herd. So let's go back to, a method, right, is to trap and remove and replace. Is that effective? And how costly is that?
It's costly. And it could be effective as long as you sustain it forever, right? Soon as you remove these several animals that you trapped with a huge amount of effort and time and resources, as soon as you remove those deer, either new deer are going to come in because we have this habitat that's, providing everything they need, or the following, fawning season, these deer are just going to be replaced with the next generation of deer. So whatever we decide to do, we need to make sure that we can sustain it or recognize that this is a short-term, fix. It's a Band-Aid and we can expect that as soon as that effort is.
So, and I don't know, maybe you can comment on this because I have heard also that trapping, if you don't remove them far enough from their home range, they inevitably come back. Is that true or not true?
That, to an extent, and it varies species by species, but with trap and relocate, we also have to consider if you believe that trapping is the kinder thing because we're not killing an animal, right? Keep in mind that we're taking an animal out of an environment that it's comfortable in. It knows the habitat, it knows the food, it knows the dangers, and we're just dropping it off somewhere totally new. So, that's comes with its own negatives as well, right? We're putting an animal in an environment that it's just not comfortable in, or maybe there's already a saturation of other animals there, and now it has to compete for limited resources, or we're potentially moving disease across the landscape. So, while it might on the surface seem like, well, at least we didn't have to kill that animal to get rid of the problem. We just moved the problem somewhere else. Yeah.
So we're going to come back to sharpshooting and public hunting, but are there other methods that have been used? I know in geese, right? I don't want to compare geese to deer, but I know in geese that there's been a method of sterilizing eggs. Is there any type of method other than the three that we just mentioned, public hunting, sharpshooting, and relocating?
Sure. There are contraceptives for deer as well.
And how effective are those?
They're effective on the individual animal for a period of time. However, to basically apply these contraceptives, we have to have the deer in hand. So we have to, immobilize the deer. So we have to tranquilize it or capture it. And then we have to give it this injection. And then that female will not have fawns for a period of 3 years-ish. But so
expensive,
a lot of, human power required to do this. And then if you consider, that subset of deer is not going to reproduce, but there's still, we didn't trap all of them, right? And unless we're in a closed system, new unsterilized deer are going to come in and they're just going to breed. And if the problem with deer is they're eating my garden or they're causing vehicle collisions, we sterilize this doe, so we might have capped her ability to add to the population, but we didn't remove the damage that individual animal is causing.
Right. And with everything, there's a cost point to all of this. All right, so let's go back to public hunting and sharpshooting. Let's end with sharpshooting. So let's talk about public hunting. So that obviously can be very controversial. You have hunters within a public space. Now, granted, we're not talking about, is it Act 71 that allowed archery hunting?
I don't think it's, is it?
Well, whatever.
It's out there.
There was a new legislation that allowed people to archery hunt within municipal boundaries, provided they were further than 100 yards, I believe, something of that nature. So we're not talking that type of public hunting, but we're talking about public hunting on municipal-owned property. So, for instance, I know the city of Green Bay does it. How effective is that? And can you speak to any problems that they've run into?
Sure, it is effective, and also it's pretty well accepted because it's there's some degree of separation from the municipality itself taking this certain action. They're allowing public hunting on city-owned properties. So it's maybe more accepted than sharpshooting. It does provide hunters this recreational opportunity while also addressing this overpopulation issue. Hunters within that program have the option to donate the venison to, community pantries. So there's a good aspect there.
So when Green Bay's doing this public hunt, and is Howard also doing one?
Yes.
Are they looking?
So they are.
I'm assuming that the area that they're allowing public hunting to occur has to meet some criteria. Like for us, right? Like I can't go and allow public hunting, at Legion Park. way too populated, not enough acreage. So like what type of areas are they allowing public hunting in?
They're identifying specific areas where they feel that there's a large enough contiguous land base that hunters could, hunt the property without posing a risk to the general public.
Right. So like Bears Creek, I believe, is one.
And I'm sure that users of the trail there have been within proximity to hunters and probably never even known it.
No, sure.
Because one thing that the city of Green Bay has done really well with their program is the hunters understand that they're providing a service to the city by removing these deer, but it's also a privilege. And, they want to reflect well on the hunting community. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure that this hunting program, is accepted by the community. So there's a level of responsibility these hunters take on to make sure that they can maintain this right to hunt these properties.
Sure. So, but it goes without saying, right, that the areas that they're allowing hunting in have a level of acreage mm-hmm. that allows the hunter to have very limited contact or problems mm-hmm. with the general public.
Yep.
And we have a couple of places like that. So, like Southwest Park, we've got a large continuous piece of acreage, and maybe to a lesser degree, our East River. But, other than that, we would struggle to find the acreage, at least I think. Now, I know there's no measuring stick for that, but so public hunting's probably a tough one for the city of De Pere here, which leads me to my last one, sharpshooting. So in my understanding and talking about this subject for over the last 10 years, sharpshooting appears to be the most economical and effective in herd reduction of all of the options that the city of De Pere would have. And that's an opinion of mine. So can you talk about, but now sharpshooting, in talking with the people that do it, this is, when people first hear of what they do, like, you're kidding me, right? That's not real. But can you go into maybe a little detail of what's all involved with this sharpshooting?
Sure. So, your municipality is going to contract with professionals that, mm-hmm.
Are
trained to do
this isn't just the general public signing up and they get to go bring their...
Nope. So this is, probably USD Wildlife Services or something similar to that, where they have trained staff that this is what they do. Now, this is a permitted activity through the DNR, and they would be permitted to maybe bait a specific site that the city has identified as like a hot spot where we want to reduce the population in this specific area. And they come in and they're discreet. They're good at what they do. They can remove a lot of deer in a short period of time, and it can have an immediate short term, or depending on, the sustainability of this practice, potentially a longer term impact on the herd in that location. So it can be a really good tool for communities. It is relatively expensive. Everything costs money. Mm-hmm. But I guess in your situation where you don't feel comfortable having anyone from the public just hunting within, the city, mm-hmm. This probably is one of your best tools.
So with sharpshooting, and I had a long talk with the gentleman from the USDA that would, help mm-hmm. coordinate the professionals that do this. But I was shocked to hear that, they go around town, they find kind of wooded areas where deer tend to be seen. And you're right, they bait them, and the deer are on a very regular pattern. And some of these places, they're like, I don't want to say they're sitting on someone's porch, but they are in and amongst, houses. They can see houses all around them, when they're mm-hmm. doing this. Again, they're professionals, and they set the site up so that when they do shoot, there's nothing behind them. It's very calculated. It's very professional. But people were shocked when I told them, yeah, there's you could probably look out your back porch window and you can see them.
Mm-hmm.
It's that, intimate. And I know when I express to people, again, the number of people are like, just get rid of the deer, get rid of the deer. Yeah, if you got to shoot them, that's fine. Kind of blunt. But then when I told them, like, well, this is kind of what happens with the sharpshooter. Like, well, you're not going to sit out in my backyard. Mm-hmm. So once again, they want the deer gone, but the method to do it is very controversial, and they don't want that. So, I mean, we're stuck in this, like back and forth. Get rid of the deer. Yeah, I don't want you to do that. Get rid of the deer. No, you can't do that either. It's very challenging. So that's why, again, great idea for the DNR not to say, you have a problem, do it at this number. But it's a challenge. And at the end of the day, most people don't want the deer slaughtered. Most people like to see the deer. They just don't want them tearing up their lawn, eating their plants, and they don't want to, as everyone, they don't want to run into it with their brand new shiny BMW, it's a challenge in order to get through that. So, and that's why I don't think the City of De Pere is, at this point, has not enacted anything, because, there's deer here. You mentioned it, that, there's deer here, and there's kind of a little bit of higher concentration of them. But it may not be to the point where other communities are enacting some herd reduction measures. I'll go back a little bit. I had mentioned some of our numbers. We had up to like 33, 36 deer in one particular section. I talked with my friend up in Green Bay, who's the park director, and they had 60, in the Preble area. So, I mean, that's a big difference. Mm-hmm. That's a big difference. So, all right. So we kind of spun around the different methods and, how it's very challenging to embrace the herd reduction methods. So let's go back. And I said I was going to come back to this. Let's go back to what can people do, to coexist with the urban deer so they're not a nuisance to them. So what are tactics that they can do with their own yard?
Yeah. So if you're having a deer issue in your own yard, unfortunately, you're just going to have to exclude the deer from where they're causing damage. So if you have a garden, it might mean you have to put up a 8-foot fence around your garden to protect those vegetables. If there's a specific newly planted tree that, you just don't want to get browsed off, you might have to cage that off. I'm at the point on my own property where I can't plant anything that's even remotely palatable to a deer. So
you just mentioned that word, palatable. Mm-hmm. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the DNR has a website. They talk about plants, landscape plantings that you can plant that deer just don't like, right? Is that?
Yeah. And if they get hungry enough, they'll eat anything, right? But there's certain plants that we know they're not preferred. So like blue flag iris, for example, I can plant iris all over my yard and it won't get touched. Mm-hmm. Daffodils, they won't touch. So over time, I've learned, I might want to plant this, but I don't get to, or it's going to get eaten. So, like you mentioned, there's resources out there. Even if you go to your garden store, right on the tag for these different plants, they're going to say deer resistant or things like that. So that's something that we need to pay attention to.
So the resources that are out there. So if I'm not mistaken, the DNR has a page that's dedicated to homeowners and what they can do to help deter deer, from pounding their landscape. Are there other resources? Does the extension offices or?
Yeah, the extension office. I know that UW-Madison has a whole big, not a department, but a lab dedicated to urban nuisance issues. And it's not just deer, it's coyotes to skunks to, you name it, raccoons. So there's all sorts of resources out there. Obviously, the reason that we're still talking about this, and we could talk about it, 1 year and 5 years from now, there's no golden bullet. There's no perfect solution out here. If there was, this conversation would be done. So we just have to kind of just cherry pick the options that are best for us and add them up to this is what we can do.
Mm-hmm. So we covered a lot. We covered, as I said in the beginning, we covered, this particular issue has multiple layers. I mean, there's the first layer of like, what do deer do? Like, what problems do they cause? Then there's the layer of communities trying to figure out, if they got a problem or not, and then once you figure out if you have a problem, then you got to figure out, is the community willing to implement tactics that can reduce the herd, which are very controversial in the sense that, deer are very cute looking animals, and, they hold special places in people's hearts, not only for people that are, animal, enthusiasts, but, hunters. I can't tell you how many hunters that I know that think the deer is an incredible, wonderful creature. And, they don't want to see deer unnecessarily, perished as well. So there's all these different layers to that. So is there anything and then we talked about what homeowners can do to help, right? You're not going to get rid of deer, but what can they do to help keep them away? So we talked about all these layers. Is there anything that we missed that you can think of?
No, I think you summarized that really well. We just established that this is a complex emotional issue. And I think the best thing we can do moving forward is kind of collectively recognize that we all have our different opinions on what an acceptable amount of damage is in a community, or what an acceptable number of deer in a community is. Recognize that my opinion might be different than my neighbor's, and kind of give each other a little bit of grace. I've attended, neighborhood meetings or public forums where I think people are really surprised to see how diverse the perspectives on this issue are. And one of the best things to come out of this was people recognizing that it's not necessarily us against the community leaders, or us against anyone. This is just a really complex issue, and there's not a great answer here.
Yep.
But we just need to collectively work together to figure it out, and recognize that there's things we can do, but what's the opportunity cost of all of that?
Well, Steve, I can't thank you enough for spending the time with us and share your knowledge, because you obviously are far more knowledgeable than the average person when it comes to this topic. So I really appreciate you being here. One thing, I'm going to put you on the spot. At the end of Bridging De Pere, one of the things that we want to do is ask people their favorite memory of De Pere. So we're going to put you on the spot a little bit. And, can you think of what's your favorite memory of De Pere?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any one specific memory, but I love hanging out at Voyager Park with the family. There's just so many different events down there throughout the year that we find ourselves just going down there to see what's going on. And if nothing's going on, it's just a beautiful place to hang out. And then downtown, we loved going out to different restaurants there, having a meal, and then just walking the shops. So just spending time down there is really fun for us.
Can't agree with you more. Mine, I've been very fortunate here to be part of a lot of really cool things. But I will say that probably the most recent one, any people know of the holiday light show that we do. We were supposed to be closed on Christmas Eve, but my family convinced me to open it up and ask people to bring in a non-perishable food item that could be donated. So I'm like, you guys, that's what you want to do on your Christmas Eve? That's fine. So we promoted it, and our community, I was blown away. Our community came in carloads. We had a record number that night of people going through the holiday light show, and they donated money and non-perishable food items that were given to Paul's Pantry. And what was donated was able to feed a family of 4 for an entire year. So I sat there in awe all night of these people coming out of nowhere to donate for this cause. It was incredible. And mind you, we've had the holiday light show open before on Christmas Eve, just a handful of cars. So I'm blown away with this community. I'm blown away with that evening. And this is a great community. I think I'll end it with that one because it is one heck of a community. So that's a wrap here for Bridging De Pere. Steve, thank you again for joining us here today and sharing your knowledge on the deer issue. If any of you folks are out there listening, have other topics that you would like to hear, please get a hold of us here at the City of De Pere. And that's it for today. Have a great day, everybody.